The paper hit the table between them like a gunshot. Alma Keene did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at things long before she ever set foot in Caldwell, Kansas. She had stopped flinching the morning she buried her father in Missouri clay, stopped flinching the afternoon the bank had handed her a notice of foreclosure with the same careless expression a man uses when swatting a fly. She had traveled 300 miles in a rattling stagecoach with $40 sewn into the lining of her boot, a carpetbag with 2 dresses and a tin photograph, and a name she was not sure meant anything anymore. She had arrived in a town that owed her nothing, and she had known it the moment she stepped off the stage and felt the silence of strangers watching her. But the paper on the table was something else entirely. Warren Reed stood across from her in the dim office of the Caldwell Land Registry, his jaw set hard as quarried stone, his dark eyes unreadable in the afternoon light that bled through a single dusty window. He was not a small man. He filled doorways and silenced rooms the way storms fill a valley, with an almost effortless authority that she suspected he had never once questioned. His hat was in his hand, which she had already learned meant he was trying to be civil. He failed at civil when he spoke. "That deed," he said in a voice low enough to be dangerous, "belonged to my family for 22 years, and whatever game your father was running before he died, it does not change the fact that this land is not yours." She looked at the deed. She looked at her name on it, written in her father's shaking hand. She looked back at Warren Reed and felt something shift inside her chest, something that was equal parts fury and a kind of grief she had no words for yet. "My father paid for that land," she said. "He paid for it in cash in 1878 in a private agreement with a man named Gerald Reed, who, I believe, was your father." The silence that followed was the kind that carries weight. Warren Reed set his hat on the table beside the deed with a deliberateness that made her breath catch. His eyes did not leave hers, and in them she saw something she had not expected to find in an enemy. She saw doubt, the faintest crack in that wall of certainty, a hairline fracture that told her he had not been entirely sure of himself when he walked through that door. She filed that away the way a woman files every piece of information she is given in a world that gives her very little. She did not yet know that this moment, this exact confrontation in this dusty office in this indifferent town, was the beginning of something she had no category for. She did not yet know that Warren Reed's doubt would grow into an obsession, and that his obsession would grow into something neither of them could outrun. She did not know that by the time autumn rolled across the Kansas plains, she would be owed something far greater than a deed to 40 acres of dry grassland, and that the man standing across from her with a cracked heart and a stubborn jaw would be the one who made sure of it. But that was later. First came the storm. Alma Keene had not planned to come to Caldwell. She had planned to go to her cousin Mary in Wichita, but the coach had broken an axle 30 miles south of there, and a cattle drover named Henderson had told her Caldwell was closer and had decent work for a woman who could sew or cook or keep books. She could do all 3, which he had seemed to find remarkable. She had not told him that she had also been running the accounts for her father's mill since she was 16, or that she could read a contract faster than most men who had been to school, because she had learned early that announcing what you were capable of tended to make people uncomfortable rather than useful. The town of Caldwell in the summer of 1881 was a cattle town doing its best to decide what it wanted to be. The Kishom Trail ran through the southern edge of it, and the drovers still came in with their herds every season, loud and sun-hardened and hungry for something cold to drink. But there were families trying to build something permanent, churches going up between saloons, women planting kitchen gardens behind frame houses that smelled of fresh lumber. It was a town in the middle of becoming something, and it had not yet decided whether that something would be decent. Alma had walked into the Caldwell Hotel on a Tuesday afternoon with her carpetbag and her $40 and asked about a room. The woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Holt, had looked her over with the particular assessment of a woman taking stock of another woman's circumstances, and had offered her a room on the second floor at 75 cents a week. It was clean and had a window and a wash basin and a view of the main street below, and Alma had counted out 3 weeks' rent and felt the diminishment of her resources with a clarity that sharpened everything. She had spent her first day in Caldwell walking the town and learning it the way she had always learned new places, systematically, quietly, watching the way the people moved and talked and arranged themselves. She had identified the mercantile, the land registry, the sheriff's office, the livery, the 2 churches, the telegraph office, and 3 establishments that sold whiskey. She had identified the social architecture of the place with equal efficiency. There was an established class of ranchers and merchants who ran things, a working class of cowhands and tradespeople who kept things running, and a fringe of people passing through or struggling to find a foothold. She placed herself firmly in the last category and set about changing it. The land deed had been in her father's strongbox, which she had found under his bed the morning after he died in April. She had not known about it until then. Her father, Thomas Keene, had been a mill owner and a man of modest but reliable habits, not the kind of man who kept secrets, or so she had believed. But the deed was there, 40 acres of grassland outside Caldwell, Kansas, purchased in 1878 for $600 from one Gerald Reed. Her father had never mentioned it. She had no idea why he had bought it or what he had intended to do with it. But it was hers now, and it was the only thing she had of any value, and she had come to Caldwell to find out what was on that land and what she could do with it. What she had found was that the land was currently being grazed by cattle wearing the brand of the R Ranch, which belonged to a man named Warren Reed, who had apparently been grazing that parcel since his father's death 2 years prior, without any awareness that his father had sold it. The discovery of this fact had led her directly to the Caldwell Land Registry, where she had filed her claim, and which had apparently sent notice to Warren Reed, who had arrived at the registry office within 2 hours of receiving it. The confrontation in that registry office lasted another 20 minutes, during which time Warren Reed went through several stages of what she could only describe as controlled fury. He was not a man who raised his voice. She found that more unnerving than shouting would have been. He spoke in clipped, precise sentences that told her he was intelligent, that he had thought about this carefully before he came, and that he had expected to walk in and dismantle her claim in 5 minutes flat. Instead, he had read the deed twice. He had checked the date, the signature, the seal of the notary. He had asked the land registry clerk, a pale young man named Simons who clearly wished to be anywhere else, to confirm the filing. He had stood very still for a long moment afterward, his hat in his hands, and then he had looked at Alma Keene with an expression she was still trying to parse an hour later. "I need to speak with my attorney," he said finally. "I expected as much," she said. "Where are you staying?" "The Caldwell Hotel." "Don't make any arrangements about that land until we have spoken again." She had met his gaze directly, which she could tell unsettled him slightly, the way it always unsettled men who were not used to women meeting their gaze directly. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I did not travel 300 miles to be told to wait." He had not answered that. He had taken the deed, which she had let him take because she had already made a copy, and he had walked out of the registry office with his shoulders very straight and the particular gait of a man who is managing something carefully. She had stood there for a moment after he left, listening to the sound of his boots fade down the boardwalk, and she had thought with a clarity that surprised her, that man is going to be a problem. She had been right. She had not been right in the way she expected. Mrs. Holt at the hotel proved to be a more useful source of information than she had initially appeared. Over supper that first evening, she had, without being asked, provided a comprehensive accounting of the Reed family, the R Ranch, and Warren Reed standing in Caldwell. The R was the largest cattle operation in that part of Kansas. Gerald Reed had built it from nothing, starting with 100 head of longhorns and 20 years of unrelenting work, and Warren had grown it to nearly 3,000 head on 40,000 acres. Gerald Reed had died in 1879 of a heart attack, leaving the ranch to Warren, his only surviving son. Warren's mother had died when he was 12. He had a younger sister named Clara who had married a man in Abilene. "He is a fair man," Mrs. Holt had said, with the measured tone of someone choosing their words carefully. "He is hard, but he is fair. He has never cheated a man out of what was his, not to my knowledge. He will not take well to this." "I am not asking him to take well to it," Alma had said. "I am asking him to honor a legal agreement." Mrs. Holt had looked at her with something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, and was perhaps some compound of both. "He will come back with his attorney," she said. "Vance Holloway, be careful of Vance Holloway." She had been careful of Vance Holloway, who arrived the following morning with a leather satchel and a smile that reminded her of the kind of men who sold land in places they had never seen to people who could not read contracts. He was perhaps 45. With silver at his temples and a quality of deliberate pleasantness that she had learned to distrust. Warren Reed stood behind him in the doorway of the hotel's small parlor with his arms crossed and his face unreadable. Holloway presented a series of arguments in swift succession, each of which she dismantled quietly and without hostility, citing the specific legal framework of private land agreements under Kansas territorial law, the validity of the notary seal, and the recorded nature of the filing. She had spent 2 evenings preparing. She watched Holloway's smile become more fixed with each exchange. She watched Warren Reed's arms slowly uncross. She watched him begin to watch her in a different way, with an attention that was not yet anything other than calculation, but was no longer dismissive. When Holloway ran out of arguments, he tried a different approach. "Miss Keene," he said, "you are clearly an intelligent woman, and I do not doubt your father paid something for this deed. But this is cattle country. This land is being actively used. Surely some compensation arrangement could be—" "Mr. Holloway," she said, "I am not interested in compensation. I am interested in my property." A silence. Warren Reed spoke from the doorway. "What do you intend to do with 40 acres of Kansas grassland?" She looked at him. "I intend to farm it." The look that crossed his face was not contempt, though she had expected contempt. It was something more complicated, something that looked almost like concern. "That land sits in the middle of my grazing corridor," he said. "If you fence it, I know," she said. Another silence, heavier than the first. Holloway was still smiling, but it had become the smile of a man watching a chess match he had entered expecting to win and was now uncertain of. "I need time," Warren Reed said finally. Not to Holloway, to her. "You have until the end of the week," she said. "I am not an unreasonable person, but I am not a yielding one either." He had looked at her for a long moment, and in that look she saw the hairline fracture again, wider now, and something underneath it that she could not name. Then he nodded once, short and deliberate, and left with Holloway, and she sat in the parlor and felt her hands shaking in her lap in the quiet aftermath, because she was absolutely terrified, and she was absolutely not going to let anyone in this town see that. She needed the land to mean something. She had a plan, carefully constructed on the stagecoach ride and in the evening since, built from everything she knew about dryland farming and what she had read about Kansas soil. She would plant wheat on the back 20 acres and establish a kitchen garden for the season. She would need seed money and tools, and she would need to find work in town to sustain herself until the first planting. The plan was not comfortable, but it was real, and it was hers, and it required the land. She found work the following day at the Caldwell Mercantile, where the owner, a widower named Douglas Farr who wore spectacles and smelled of tobacco, needed someone to keep his accounts. She was good at accounts. She had a wage by the end of the conversation. She also found, over the course of that week, that Caldwell was in the process of making up its mind about her. The town watched her with the particular attention reserved for strangers who did not behave the way strangers were expected to behave. She was not timid, and she was not reckless. She was direct in a way that some found refreshing and others found unsettling. She asked questions that got to the point. She listened more than she spoke. She made a friend, tentatively, in a woman named Rosa Delgado, who ran the small laundry at the south end of Main Street, a Mexican woman of 30 with quick dark eyes and a practical intelligence that Alma recognized and trusted immediately. Rosa had been in Caldwell for 6 years and knew the town the way only people who are watched without being fully seen ever come to know a place, completely. It was Rosa who told her what she had not yet found out for herself, that the 40 acres her father had bought sat along the edge of a seasonal creek bed that ran water 3 months of the year, which made it considerably more valuable than 40 acres of dry grass, and that at least 2 other ranchers in the county had wanted to buy it from Gerald Reed before he had sold it to her father. "Warren Reed does not know you have the water rights," Rosa said one evening while they were sitting on Rosa's porch with cups of coffee. "When he figures that out, this is going to get more complicated." "He will figure it out," Alma said. "Yes," Rosa said. "He is not a stupid man." "No," Alma said. "He is not." She had thought about Warren Reed more than she wanted to admit in those first days. Not with softness, not yet, but with the kind of thorough attention she gave to any problem that required solving. She had tried to build a picture of him from the pieces she collected. Mrs. Holt's careful praise of his fairness, Rosa's assessment that he was hard but honest, the way Holloway deferred to him despite clearly believing himself the smarter of the two, the registry clerk Simons who had told her quietly, when she came back to check her filing, that Warren Reed had come back alone after the first meeting and read the deed for a 3rd time. "He was very quiet about it," Simons had said, in the voice of a man sharing something he felt he should not share. "He just sat there in the back room for a long time. I think he was upset. Not angry exactly. More like he was grieving something." She had thought about that. A man grieving something. She had recognized that. It was perhaps the first thing about Warren Reed that had made him feel like a person rather than an obstacle. He came to see her on Thursday, 3 days into the week she had given him. He came alone, without Holloway, which she noted. He came to the Mercantile in the early afternoon during a quiet stretch, and he took his hat off when he stepped inside and looked around until he found her at the back desk with a ledger open in front of her. She set down her pen and waited. He walked back to her desk and stood for a moment, turning his hat in his hands, which she now knew was his tell for the effort of civility. "I looked into the deed," he said. "My father's signature is genuine. I had it verified." He paused. "He sold you that land." "He sold my father that land," she said. "He sold your father that land," he repeated, as though the slight correction had cost him something to absorb. "I do not know why. He never mentioned it. He kept the books himself those last years and I was running the herd. I should have checked more carefully after he died." Another pause. "I should have known." She recognized self-reproach when she heard it and she felt something ease slightly in her chest. "You could not have known what he did not tell you," she said. He looked at her. "Is that meant to make me feel better?" "No," she said honestly. "It is meant to be accurate." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not yet, but a slight relaxing of the severity around his eyes. "I want to make you an offer," he said. "A fair one. I will buy that land from you at market rate for comparable parcels in this county. The current rate is approximately $4 per acre, which would put the price at $160. Given what you paid, I did not pay anything," she said. "My father paid $600. He went still. 600. In 1878, yes." She watched him process this. She watched the understanding move through him, slow and heavy, that his father had sold 40 acres at $15 per acre in 1878 and had never said a word about it. "Why so much?" he said almost to himself. "I have my own thoughts about that," she said carefully. "The land has a seasonal creek." His jaw tightened. "Yes. The water rights convey with the deed." A silence that had a different quality than any of the previous ones. She watched him put it together, watched the full weight of it settle on him. Not just 40 acres of grassland in his grazing corridor. 40 acres of water access in a part of Kansas that would be looking at drought conditions within the decade. Every rancher who had been paying attention to the rainfall data knew the water question was coming. His father had known it too, apparently, and had sold the answer to it to a stranger in Missouri for reasons that Warren Reed was still not able to explain. "My offer stands," he said finally, and his voice was very controlled. $160. "No," she said, "not yet. Miss Keene, Mr. Reed." She looked at him directly and kept her voice even. "I did not come here to sell land. I came here to farm it. I have a plan for those 40 acres that does not involve selling them. What I need is time to implement it, and what I need from you is the removal of your cattle from my parcel so that I can begin. If you fence that parcel, I know what it will do to your grazing corridor." "I have thought about that." She opened the desk drawer and took out a sheet of paper she had written on the previous night. "I have a proposal." He took the paper and read it. She watched him read it, watched his eyes move down the page, watched his expression go through several stages of something she could not fully read. She had proposed a shared water use agreement. Her land, her wheat fields, her rights, but the creek access available to his cattle at defined points along the eastern edge of the parcel during the dry months, in exchange for a nominal annual payment and the use of 2 of his ranch hands for the initial fencing labor. It was not a proposal that was generous to him. It was, however, a proposal that acknowledged his practical reality while firmly establishing hers. He would still have the water access his herd needed. She would have her wheat fields and her income and her foothold. He folded the paper in half. He did not speak for a long moment. When he looked up at her, the hairline fracture she had first seen in the registry office was fully open now, and what she saw through it was not doubt but something rawer, something that looked like respect, complicated and reluctant and entirely unwelcome to him. "I need to think about this," he said. "You have until Saturday," she said. He came back Friday morning. He sat across from her in the parlor of the hotel, where Mrs. Holt had placed a pot of coffee on the table with the slightly theatrical discretion of a woman who intended to hear everything from the kitchen. Warren Reed held his cup without drinking from it and looked at the proposal she had revised slightly based on a second conversation with Rosa, who knew land agreements better than Alma had expected. "There are things in here I want to change," he said. "Tell me which ones." They negotiated for 2 hours. It was, she would later think, the strangest 2 hours of her time in Caldwell, because they were arguing about creek access points and fencing schedules and seasonal grazing rights, and all of it was perfectly rational, and underneath all of it she was acutely, inconveniently, almost painfully aware of him as a person. The way he thought, the way he pushed back on her reasoning when he had a genuine counterargument and yielded when he did not. The way he ran one hand along his jaw when he was working through a problem, a gesture so unconscious she was sure he had no idea he did it. The way he had called her by her full name, Alma, just once, by accident, in the middle of a sentence about the eastern fence line, and had stopped and said Miss Keene with a formality that was slightly overdone because they were both pretending the slip had not happened. By the end of the 2 hours they had a working agreement. She would take possession of the parcel, remove his cattle, and begin fencing with the labor of 2 double-R hands. He would retain defined water access points for his herd from July through September each year, with the payment of $12 annually, which she had argued up from 8 and he had argued down from 15, and which they had both arrived at with the mutual satisfaction of people who had worked for something. He signed the agreement. She signed it. Simons witnessed it at the registry the following morning. She walked out of that registry office with a property agreement in her hand and the deed to 40 acres of Kansas grassland and water rights, and she stood on the boardwalk in the morning light and let herself feel, for just a moment, something that was not quite triumph but was adjacent to it, something that tasted like solidity after a long time of nothing to stand on. She did not know that Warren Reed stood at the window of the registry office for a moment after she left, watching her walk down the boardwalk with her back straight and her head up, and that the expression on his face was one that Simons, who had witnessed the whole transaction, would describe to his wife that evening as a man who had just lost an argument and could not decide whether he was angry or impressed, and who was beginning to suspect it might be something else altogether. The first week of actual work on the land was the hardest thing Alma Keene had done since burying her father. The two ranch hands Warren Reed sent were named Cutter and Frank. Cutter was a lean, sun-darkened man in his 40s who said very little and worked with the steady competence of someone who had been building fences since before she was born. Frank was younger, perhaps 25, with a cheerful disposition and an admirable ability to talk continuously while driving fence posts with a precision that contradicted the apparent randomness of the conversation. She worked alongside them, which clearly surprised them, and within 2 days they had settled into an efficient rhythm. The land itself was beautiful in a way she had not anticipated. She had thought of Kansas as flat and featureless, the way people who have not been there tend to think of it, but the parcel her father had bought ran along a slight rise that gave it a view east across the grassland that at dawn was the color of hammered copper. The creek bed was dry in June, but the soil around it was dark and rich with the memory of water, and when she knelt and took a handful of it and let it sift through her fingers, she could feel the potential in it the way you can feel warmth in a stone that has been sitting in the sun. Warren Reed came out to see the progress on the third day. He did not announce himself. She looked up from the survey line she was laying out, and he was simply there, sitting his horse at the edge of the property with his hat against the sun, watching. She straightened up and looked at him and waited. He got down from the horse and walked over with the unhurried gait of a man on his own land, which she understood was still, on some level, how he thought of it. "Cutter is placing the northwest corner post correctly," she said, before he could speak. "I wasn't going to say he wasn't," he said. "You had the look of a man about to say something about the northwest corner post." That surprised a near smile out of him, brief and involuntary, quickly suppressed. He looked at the staked survey lines, at the cleared ground she had begun turning with a rented plow. "You're really going to plant wheat," he said. "Winter wheat, yes, I will seed in September." He was quiet for a moment. "It's a good idea. The water access makes this soil viable for dry wheat farming. You'll need to—" He stopped. "What?" "Nothing. Mr. Reed," she said with measured patience, "if you have information that is relevant to the viability of this farm, I would rather have it than not have it." He turned to look at her. He was close enough that she could see the details of his face clearly, the sun lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular way his jaw worked when he was deciding something, the color of his eyes, which she had thought were brown but in this light were something more complex, dark amber with a rim of darker brown, warm and direct. He was, she acknowledged to herself, a very striking man. She filed this information under irrelevant and kept her expression neutral. "The soil composition on this parcel shifts about 20 yards north of the creek bed," he said, after a moment. "There's a clay layer closer to the surface up there. Wheat roots won't penetrate it well. You'll want to keep your planting field south of that line." She looked at where he was indicating. She thought about the survey she had done. She recalculated her planting layout in her head. He was right. She had not known about the clay layer. She would have found out eventually after losing a section of planting to poor germination, and it would have cost her time she could not easily afford. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, short and a little uncomfortable, as though being thanked was something he did not have a great deal of practice with. He looked out across the parcel again. "What else are you planning?" she told him. She laid out the full picture. The wheat fields, the kitchen garden, the longer-term plan to build a small structure on the western edge by autumn, to have something permanent before winter. She talked about it the way she talked about everything that mattered to her, with a directness that did not perform enthusiasm but was full of it underneath, and she watched him listen. He asked 3 questions, each of them specific and practical and good. She answered them. He suggested a modification to her fencing plan that she initially resisted, and then, after thinking about it for 30 seconds, recognized as correct. She told him so. He looked slightly startled to hear it. She thought that probably not very many people told Warren Reed directly when he was right, and that this might be one of the things that made being Warren Reed rather lonely. This was the first time she thought about his loneliness. It would not be the last. He left after perhaps 40 minutes, riding back toward the Double R without ceremony. Cutter watched him go and then looked at Alma with an expression she could not read. "That's the longest I've seen Mr. Reed talk to anyone who wasn't a ranch hand or a lawyer in about 2 years," he said, and then went back to driving fence posts with the air of a man who had said exactly what he intended to and no more. She thought about that for the rest of the day. She also thought about what Rosa had told her the previous week, filling in the parts of Warren Reed's history that Mrs. Holt had not covered. His wife, a woman named Catherine, had died in 1879, the same year as his father. She had died in July of a fever that had come on fast and taken her in 4 days. Warren had been away with the cattle drive and had not made it back in time. He had come home to an empty house and 2 fresh graves in the space of 6 weeks. "He has not been the same since," Rosa had said, with the simple factual tone of someone stating a thing everyone in Caldwell knew. "He works. He runs the ranch. He is polite to people in town, but he has been closed up like a window no one has opened in a long time. Some people think he will never open again. I am not sure those people have been watching him as carefully as I have." Rosa had looked at her when she said that last part, with a directness that made Alma feel slightly transparent, and Alma had looked at her coffee cup and said nothing. July arrived, and the Kansas heat came with it. The kind of heat that sits on you like a physical thing, that makes the horizon shimmer and the ground creak, that turns the air in the middle of the day into something you have to push through. Alma worked in the early mornings and evenings and spent the midday hours at the mercantile or in the hotel, going over her accounts and her planting plans and the slowly expanding network of small connections she was building in Caldwell. She had begun to be known, not famous, not important, but recognized, which in a new place was the first step toward belonging. Douglas Farr at the mercantile had discovered that her account keeping had saved him $12 in overcharges from his dry goods supplier, and had raised her wages accordingly, and told his wife, who had told several other women. And the result was that Alma had been invited to the Wednesday sewing circle, which she went to less for the sewing and more for the information. Because a sewing circle in a small town in 1880, one was where you learned everything that mattered. She learned at the sewing circle that the county was in a dispute with a man named Barrett Hale, a land speculator out of Topeka, who had been filing claims on abandoned parcels and then reselling them at inflated prices, and that several families had been caught up in contested ownership situations as a result. She learned that the circuit judge would be in Caldwell in September for the autumn session. She filed this away. She also learned, from a woman named Edna Marsh, who was the wife of one of Warren Reed's neighboring ranchers, that Warren Reed had not attended a single social event in Caldwell since his wife's death, and that Holloway had been quietly attempting to consolidate Reed's legal affairs in a way that some people found mildly concerning, though no one had been willing to say so directly to Warren. She thought about this for several days before she decided it was not her business. And then she thought about it for several more days and decided, reluctantly, that it might be. The creek ran in August, as Rosa had predicted it would, and the change to the land was remarkable. The dry bed she had been working around for 6 weeks became a living thing, shallow and quick, cutting along the eastern edge of the parcel with a sound that felt like something breathing. She stood at the edge of it the morning it came, and felt something she could only call gratitude, a feeling so large and uncomplicated that it briefly overwhelmed the careful composure she had been maintaining. Warren Reed had been bringing his cattle to the designated access points, which were east of her fencing on a secondary parcel she had agreed to leave ungated. She had not seen him since the afternoon in June when he had told her about the clay lair. She had heard about him in the way you hear about significant people in a small town, second-hand, in passing, in the texture of other conversations. He came to the creek on a morning in early August, not with the cattle but alone, on horseback. She was down at the water's edge checking the erosion on the bank where she intended to run a small irrigation channel to the garden, and she heard his horse before she saw him. He reined in at the fence line and looked at her across the wire and the distance between them. "The creek came in," he said, which was not a remarkable thing to say and which he clearly knew was not a remarkable thing to say, because he looked slightly embarrassed by it immediately after. "It did," she said. He got down from the horse and walked to the fence, which was her fence now, and looked out over the parcel. The wheat was not planted yet, that would come in September, but she had the kitchen garden flourishing in its south corner, and the soil turned and ready in the main field, and the whole 40 acres had the look of land that was being cared for, that was being thought about, that had a person's intention in it. "You have done a great deal of work here," he said. "Yes," she said. "I did not think." He stopped. She waited. "I did not think you would stay," he said. "Most people who come to Caldwell alone, without family, without connections, they find it harder than they expected and they go to Wichita or they go back east. I thought you would take the offer eventually." "I told you I was not a yielding person," she said. "You did," he said. He was looking at her now in a way she was becoming accustomed to. That full and careful attention that felt nothing like the way most men looked at women, which was a kind of assessment that cataloged without really seeing. Warren Reed looked at people the way he read contracts, as though he intended to understand them thoroughly, as though what was on the surface was the beginning of a much longer document. "Your father left you this," he said, "and nothing else. He left me his good name and a tin photograph," she said. "This is the useful part." "What is in the photograph?" It surprised her, the question. She looked at him for a moment. "My mother," she said. "She died when I was 9. I do not remember her well enough to know if the photograph is accurate." He was quiet. She saw him absorb this, saw the understanding of it reach something in him that lived close to his own losses. She had not said it for that purpose. She had said it because it was true and because she had stopped performing the softened version of difficult truths long before this. But she watched it land in him and felt the space between the fence wire and where she stood compress into something smaller and warmer than it had been a moment before. "I am sorry," he said. "People keep apologizing to me for things they did not do," she said. "I think perhaps what they mean is that they are sorry life is difficult." "Yes," he said, "I think that is what they mean." She looked up at him. The morning light was in his face, catching the amber in his eyes, and he was close enough now that she could see the tension he still carried in the set of his jaw beginning to ease slightly, incrementally, in the way that tension eases in a person when they are around someone who does not require it of them. "Mr. Reed," she said, and then stopped, because she was not entirely sure what she had intended to say next. "Warren," he said. She looked at him. "I have been calling you Alma in my head for 2 months, he said, with the bluntness of a man who has decided that honesty is simpler than the alternative. "I think we may as well be plain about it." She felt something happen in her chest that she did not have a name for, something quick and warm and slightly terrifying. "Alma, then," she said. "Warren." He did not smile exactly, but the severity around his eyes dissolved completely for a moment, and she saw what was underneath it, something younger than the rest of him, something that had been kept very carefully in the dark for a long time. After that, he came to the property regularly. It began with the pretext of checking the water access points, which was perfectly legitimate, and which they both understood was not entirely the reason. He brought things, small and practical things, a better grade of fence wire than she had been able to afford from FARS, a recommendation for a Kansas seed supplier whose winter wheat variety was better adapted to the soil conditions, information about the county land office and what documentation she should have on file before the circuit judge arrived in September. He brought these things without fanfare, without the particular performance of generosity that expects gratitude in return, and she accepted them in the same spirit, straightforwardly, as the practical gestures of a person who had information she could use and was willing to give it. He also began to talk to her. Not about the land, not about business, but about other things, the kind of other things that accumulate between people when they have moved past the formality of transactions into something that has not yet been named. He talked about the ranch with the love of a man who has poured 20 years of himself into something and does not entirely know how to separate himself from it. He talked about his father with a complexity that told her the relationship had been layered and unresolved, and that Gerald Reed's secrets had added a new dimension to a grief that was not yet finished. She talked, too, more than she had talked to anyone since Missouri. She told him about the mill, about learning accounts at her father's side, about the specific quality of grief that comes from watching a person you love diminish slowly rather than being taken suddenly. She told him about the months after her father's death, the legal complications, the foreclosure, the process of converting everything she owned into the $40 and the carpetbag and the deed. She told it plainly without self-pity, because she did not have patience for self-pity, and she watched him listen the way she had watched him listen in June, with that thorough and serious attention that made her feel seen in a way that was, if she was being honest, unprecedented. One August evening, they sat on the low rise at the north end of her parcel and watched the sun go down over the Kansas grassland, and the sky turned 4 colors in sequence and then faded to deep blue, and neither of them said anything for a long time. She was aware of his arm close to hers on the ground, not touching, just present, and she was aware of the particular quality of silence between two people who are comfortable enough with each other to not need to fill it. "Clara wants me to come to Abilene for Christmas," he said eventually. "Your sister," she said. "Yes, she has 2 children now, a boy and a girl. I have not seen her since the spring." He paused. "She says I am turning into a hermit. Are you?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "Perhaps," he said. "It is easier to work than to be around people." "I understand that," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know you do." She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the evening light was kind to both of them, softening the sharpness of his features and doing something warm to the color of his eyes, and she felt the full weight of what was happening between them, the full reality of it, settle on her. She felt frightened by it, genuinely frightened, which she found unexpected. She had not thought of herself as someone who could still be frightened by the good things. The bad things, yes. The uncertainty, the loneliness, the precariousness of building something from nothing, all of that she had made peace with. But this, the possibility of this, sitting on the rise with the dark coming in and a man looking at her with warmth and something that was almost certainly not just friendship in his eyes, this was terrifying in a different and more specific way. "I should go in," she said. "Yes," he said, not moving. She stood up and he stood up and they walked down the slope together in the near dark. And when they reached the fence line where his horse was tied, she stopped and turned to him. "Warren," she said, and then was not sure what she had meant to say, and looked at him with a helplessness she rarely allowed herself to show. He took one step toward her and stopped himself, and she saw the effort of it, saw the cost of that check, and saw underneath it the same fear she was feeling, just organized differently. He was afraid of different things than she was. He was afraid of the opening of things that had been closed for a long time and the terrible hope that entailed. He was afraid, she thought, of being away again when something happened, of the specific damage that particular guilt could do. "Good night, Alma," he said. "Good night," she said. She walked back to the small shelter she had built on the western edge of the parcel, where she had been sleeping 4 nights a week rather than making the daily ride to town. And she lay on the narrow cot and listened to the Kansas night, the insects and the wind and the distant sound of a coyote somewhere to the north. And she thought about Warren Reed with a thoroughness and intensity that eventually became simply feeling. warm and complicated and real. She did not know that he rode home in the dark and stood outside the ranch house for 20 minutes looking at the stars before he went inside, and that his foreman, an old cowhand named Bates who had been with the Double R since Gerald Reed started it, watched him from the bunkhouse window and felt something ease in him that had been tight for 2 years. September brought the planting, and with it the most satisfying days Alma had experienced in longer than she could count. She seeded the prepared field with winter wheat, working from dawn in the cooler air, feeling the rhythm of the work settle into her body like something coming home. Warren came 3 times during the seeding week, once with his foreman Bates to check the creek access for the autumn reduction, and twice alone, without pretext. He brought lunch the second time, a tin of roasted chicken and biscuits and a jar of tea, packed in a way that suggested someone had thought about it, and they ate sitting in the field surrounded by the smell of turned earth and wheat seed and the particular sweetness of September air. She told him about Vance Holloway on the 3rd visit, because the issue had become something she could not in good conscience stay quiet about. She had been reviewing the county land filings at the registry, a habit she had developed partly out of professional interest and partly out of the instinct that knowing the legal landscape of a place you intend to stay in is simply sensible. She had found 3 separate filings by Holloway, not as an attorney representing a client but as a principal buyer, on parcels adjacent to Double R land. Not the ranch land itself, but the approaches to it, the road access, the water margins. Individually, they were unremarkable. Together they formed a pattern that a person who understood land agreements would recognize. Warren sat very still while she explained it. She laid it out carefully, without drama, showing him the connections she had identified. He looked at the copies she had made of the relevant filings. He was very quiet for a long time. "He has been handling my legal affairs since my father died," he said. "I know," she said, "which is why I wanted to tell you directly rather than go to the sheriff." He looked up at her. "You're telling me that my attorney may be positioning himself to acquire leverage over access to my ranch." "I am telling you that the pattern of these filings is consistent with that," she said. "I may be wrong, but I thought you should see it." The expression on his face in that moment was one she had not seen on him before, a kind of naked gratitude that went under all the control he habitually maintained and came from somewhere very fundamental. She understood it. She had been a stranger in this town 3 months ago. She had had no reason to bring this to him, no obligation, no incentive. He had been her adversary. He could still, in some narrow technical sense, be considered her adversary. And she had brought it to him anyway. "Why?" he said. The word was quiet and direct and meant considerably more than its single syllable. She met his gaze. "Because it is the right thing to do," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Alma, yes, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For the way I walked into that registry office in June," he said. "I came in ready to run you off and I treated you like someone trying to take something that wasn't hers. You were the one holding a legal deed and I was the one behaving like a man who could not accept being wrong. I am sorry for that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I accept that," she said, "and I will tell you that I was also afraid when I walked in. I was terrified. I was 300 miles from anything I knew and I had $40 and a deed that represented everything I had left, and I sat across from you and I was absolutely certain I was going to have to fight for every inch of it." "You were right to be certain," he said. "Yes," she said, "I was, but I do not think you are that man entirely. I think that was fear doing the talking." He looked at her. "Fear of what?" "Of losing something else you love," she said quietly. He went very still. She held his gaze and did not look away, because this was too important to cushion in softness, and she had never been a person who cushioned important things in softness anyway. She watched the truth of what she had said move through him, watched it reach the place in him where the grief and the guilt and the 2 years of closed-upness lived, and watched something there begin, very slowly, to release. He reached out and took her hand. She let him. She felt the warmth of it, the roughness of his palm from 20 years of ranch work, and the particular care in the way he held her hand, as though it were something he was not sure he was allowed to hold, and was therefore holding with extraordinary gentleness. She thought that she had not been touched gently in a very long time, and felt the weight of that recognition move through her like water through dry soil. "I don't know how to do this carefully," he said. It has been a long time since I let anything matter." "I know," she said. "I don't want to hurt you." "I know that too," she said. "Warren, I am not a person who needs to be protected from difficulty. I need to be treated honestly. Those are different things." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, "I think I may be falling in love with you." She felt the words land in her like struck flint, clean and bright and irreversible. She sat with it for a moment, feeling it settle, and then she said, with all the directness she had, "I think I may already be there." He leaned forward and kissed her. It was careful and brief and warm and entirely honest, the way everything about him was when he dropped his guard, and she felt the rightness of it in the way you feel the rightness of a door opening that has been stuck for a long time. When they separated, she looked at him and felt, for the first time since Missouri, fully and completely unafraid. Not of the future, not of what she was building here, not of what was happening between them. Afraid of plenty of things, certainly, because she was a practical person and the future had plenty of sharp edges in it. But not of this, not of him, not of what she felt, and that was new enough to notice. October brought several things in rapid succession that changed the shape of her world considerably. The first was that Warren confronted Holloway. She was not there for it, but she heard about it from Rosa, who heard about it from Bates, who had been there. Warren had called Holloway to the ranch and presented him with the land filing evidence and asked him directly what his intentions were. Holloway, faced with the evidence laid out with Warren's particular precision, had first tried to explain it away, and then, when that did not work, had tried to negotiate. Warren had terminated his services on the spot and had given him until the end of the week to transfer all RR legal files to a new attorney in Wichita. He had also filed a formal complaint with the Kansas bar regarding Holloway's conflict of interest in managing a client's affairs while taking adjacent land positions. Rosa told her this with considerable satisfaction. Holloway tried to tell people in town that Warren was acting irrationally, Rosa said, and people asked him to explain the land filings and he could not, and so now he is preparing to relocate to Topeka, which is where men like Holloway go when they have worn out their welcome. The second thing was the circuit judge. Judge Abernathy arrived in Caldwell in the second week of October, and the following 3 days were busy with the resolution of a backlog of county legal matters. Alma attended the session regarding the Barrett-Hale land speculation dispute, because 2 of the families affected were people she had come to know, and because she had done some research into Hale's filing methods and had found an irregularity. She presented her findings to the judge in the session, quietly and with documentation, and Abernathy, who was a sharp-eyed man in his 60s who visibly appreciated competence when he encountered it, had used her findings to invalidate 4 of Hale's contested claims. Warren was there for that. He sat in the back of the courthouse and watched her stand up in front of the circuit judge and dismantle a speculator's fraudulent claims with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. And when she came out of the courthouse, he was waiting on the boardwalk with his hat in his hands, and an expression she had come to love, that specific look of a man who has been surprised by something in the best possible way. "You did not tell me you were going to do that," he said. "I did not know if the judge would let me speak," she said. "I thought it was better to simply attempt it than to announce the attempt. Where did you learn property law?" "I read," she said simply. "I have always read." He shook his head slowly, with something that was clearly admiration barely restrained by a persistent habit of reticence. "Alma," he said. "Yes." He put his hat on and offered her his arm. It was the first time he had done that, a public gesture, and she understood its weight in a town like this, where people noticed and where Warren Reed's public gestures had been exclusively professional for 2 years. She took his arm and they walked down the boardwalk together, and she felt the town rearrange itself slightly around this new configuration of them, felt the attention and the adjustment, felt some things she could not name settling into place. The third thing that happened in October was that he asked her to come to the Double R for Sunday supper. She came on a Sunday evening at the end of October, riding out in the last of the autumn light on a horse she had rented from the livery, because she needed to get one of her own now that her financial situation had stabilized enough to consider it. The Double R was 3 miles east of her parcel, set back from the main road on a rise that gave it the same kind of view she loved from her own land. The house was large for a ranch house, well built, with a covered porch along the front and a kitchen addition on the side. It was the house of a man who had intended to fill it with people and had not, and she could see that in it, the slightly unlived-in quality of too much space unused. Warren cooked, which she had not expected, and which he did with a focused seriousness that made her want to smile because it was very much like everything else he did, thorough and a bit concentrated and ultimately excellent. He made a roast with root vegetables from a kitchen garden she had not known he kept, and biscuits, and a dried apple pie that she suspected had taken him considerably more effort than he would admit. They ate at a kitchen table that was too large for 2 people, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch settling in the evening outside the windows, and felt something happen to her relationship with the concept of home, something softening and expanding. After supper he showed her the house, not with the air of a man displaying a possession, but with the air of a man who was trying to show her something he was not yet sure how to say directly. The front rooms, the bedrooms, the parlor with a bookshelf of well-worn volumes, a piano that had not been played in some years. He ran his fingers along the edge of the piano as they passed it. "Catherine played," he said. "Do you?" she asked. "No," he said. "I kept it because he stopped. I am not entirely sure why I kept it. Perhaps I thought Clara might want it. She never asked." She sat down on the piano bench and looked at the keys. She could play a little, with the limited competence of someone who had learned from a school teacher in Missouri and had not had access to a piano in years. She played a few notes, tentative and slightly imperfect. He sat in the chair nearby and listened with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded, and that look on his face that she had begun to understand was him feeling things very carefully. They sat in the parlor for a long time after, talking. They talked about his sister Clara and her husband James and the children, about his plans for the Double R through the winter, about her planting and what she expected from the wheat in the spring. They talked about Kansas, about whether it was the right place to build a life, and about what building a life meant. They talked about what they were afraid of, which was a conversation she had not had with anyone since her father died, and which had the peculiar effect of making both of them slightly uncomfortable and considerably closer. When she said she needed to go, because the ride back would be dark and she had work in the morning, he walked her out to the horse and held the reins while she mounted and then kept hold of them for a moment, looking up at her in the pale light of the new moon. "Stay," he said. "Clara has a room made up at all times. I will sleep in the bunkhouse. You can go back in the morning." It was a practical suggestion, and they both knew it was something more than that. She looked down at him for a long moment, considering him and herself and what was happening and what it was leading toward, feeling very clearly that they were standing at the edge of something large. She thought about her father's deed and the registry office and the first terrible careful negotiation and everything between then and now, and she thought, with a clarity and warmth that was entirely free of fear, that she trusted this man. "All right," she said. "Thank you," he smiled. It was the first full and unreserved smile she had seen on him. No restraint, no suppression, just the expression of a man who was genuinely, uncomplicated happy in a moment. And it changed his face entirely, and she thought, seated on that horse in the dark with the Kansas stars beginning to show, that she was very much in love with Warren Reed, and that this was without question the most unexpected and also the most right thing that had happened to her in a very long time. November came cold and clear, and with it, the kind of settling that happens between two people when they have made a decision that has not yet been spoken aloud, but has been completely made. He came to her parcel every day now. She went to the Double R on weekends. They fell into the rhythms of two people who are learning each other in the way you learn a landscape, with increasing intimacy, with the pleasure of finding new things, but also with the deep comfort of the places you come to know so well you could navigate them in the dark. She told him things she had not told anyone, about the morning of her father's funeral when she had sat in the empty mill and talked to him, knowing he could not hear, and had said all the things she had not said while he was alive. About the particular shame of the foreclosure, which was not her shame but had felt like hers. About the stagecoach journey and the broken axle, and the drover Henderson who had told her about Caldwell, and how she had sat in that broken coach in the prairie dark and thought, with a terrifying lightness, that she had absolutely nothing to lose and therefore nothing to be afraid of. He told her about his father, about the relationship between them that had been shaped by Gerald Reed's particular variety of hardness, a man who showed love through expectation and provision, and very rarely through words. He told her about finding the two graves when he came home from the drive, about standing in front of them in the afternoon heat and feeling something in him simply stop, like a clock that had been wound too tight. He told her about the 2 years since, about the work that had been more anesthetic than purpose. "I want it to be purpose again," he said, one November afternoon when they were walking the fence line of her parcel together, doing the autumn check she had asked him to help with. "I want things again." I had forgotten what that felt like until he glanced at her. "Until," she prompted. "Until a woman walked into the land registry office and took my 40 acres away from me," he said, with a dryness that made her laugh, genuinely laugh, and she heard the sound of it carry on the wind and felt how good it was, how simple and real. "I did not take them," she said. "I simply had a prior legal claim." "You most certainly did," he said, and bumped her shoulder with his in the comfortable, easy way of a man who is no longer managing the distance between himself and another person. She had $40 left in the world when she arrived in Caldwell. She had rather more now, because she had been careful and the mercantile work had been steady, and she had taken on 2 additional account-keeping clients in October. She had a field of winter wheat that she could see beginning to root in the good soil south of the clay layer. She had a small shelter on the western edge of her parcel that she had made as warm and livable as 40 acres of determination could manage. She had Rosa for friendship and Cutter's occasional practical help, and Mrs. Holt's reliable information, and a town that had made up its mind about her, mostly favorably. She had Warren Reed, who was in love with her and who said so now, not obliquely or carefully but directly, in the way of a man who has decided that honesty is the only language he is willing to use with the person who matters most to him. In December, he asked her to marry him. They were at the Double R in the parlor after supper, and she had been playing the piano again, getting better at it with the practice, and he had been sitting in the chair listening with his hands folded and the soft expression that was reserved, she now knew, entirely for her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he set down his coffee and got up from the chair and came to the piano and sat beside her on the bench, which was not quite wide enough for 2 grown people, and turned to face her. He was holding something. A ring, plain gold, warm in the firelight. It had been his mother's. He had told her about it once, described it in the context of something else, and she recognized it from the description. "I have been thinking about how to ask this for approximately 6 weeks," he said, "and I have not found a way to make it eloquent, so I am going to say it plainly. I love you. I want to spend my life with you. I want to watch you turn 40 acres of Kansas grassland into something that matters, and I want to be there when it does. I want to give you a home and a partner, and I want to be the kind of man you can rely on, not perfectly, but genuinely. Will you marry me, Alma?" She looked at the ring and then at him, at the man she had been colliding into since June, at the warmth and the seriousness and the careful love in his face, and she felt the completeness of her yes before she said it. "Yes," she said, "Warren, yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it, gold on her hand, and then he kissed her, longer this time, warmer, and she felt the full reality of it, like the creek coming in, like the smell of turned soil, like the sunrise from the rise on a clear morning, something alive and nourishing and genuinely, irreversibly hers. They were married in February of 1882 in the Caldwell Presbyterian Church on a morning when the sky was the pale gray-blue of winter, and the world was quietly beautiful in the way that Kansas winter is beautiful, stripped to its bones, and entirely honest about what it is. Rosa stood with her, as her only attendant, dressed in a blue wool dress she had made herself, with the practical competence she brought to everything, and she held Alma's bouquet of dried winter flowers and looked at her with the expression of a woman who has watched a thing she hoped for come to pass. Bates stood with Warren, which had been Warren's quiet and genuine choice, because Bates had been with the Double R for 20 years and had been more father than employee for most of it. He stood beside Warren with his best hat on and the expression of a man working very hard to keep his composure. The ceremony was simple and honest, the way they both wanted it. The vows were the traditional ones, and she meant every word of them with the full weight of her character, which was not a small weight. When the minister asked if she took this man, she looked at Warren and said yes clearly enough that people in the back pew heard it, and she felt him hold her hand slightly tighter when she did. They walked out into the February cold as husband and wife, into the congratulations of a good portion of Caldwell, into Rosa's warm embrace and Bates's handshake and Douglas Farr's approval and Mrs. Holt's happy tears. Warren stood beside her with his hand at her back and his bearing slightly changed. The severity softened into something steadier and more open, the look of a man who has come home from a long way away. The wedding supper at the Double R was boisterous in the way that suppers are when there are people there who are genuinely glad to be celebrating something. Cutter and Frank came from the ranch hand's side, and Frank talked continuously throughout the whole meal and made everyone at the table laugh 4 times, which was probably a record for Frank. Rosa danced with Bates in the kitchen doorway when someone produced a fiddle, which she did with a dignity that suggested she was allowing it rather than enjoying it, though her eyes said otherwise. Alma sat at the table in the Double R dining room and looked at the people around her, and felt something she had not felt since before her mother died. The texture of being surrounded by people who were, in varying degrees and kinds, her people. She had arrived in this town with nothing that tied her to it, nothing owed, nothing given. She had worked and argued and negotiated and trusted carefully and built, day by day and deed by deed, a life here that was recognizably and entirely her own. Warren sat beside her with his shoulder against hers and his hand near hers on the table, and he bent close at one point in the evening and said quietly, "Are you happy?" She turned to look at him. This man she had argued across a registry desk 6 months before. This man she had negotiated creek access and fence lines with. This man who had put his mother's ring on her finger and said, "Will you please?" with absolute sincerity. She looked at him and felt the simple and unassailable truth of the answer. "I am very happy," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, and the simplicity of it, the completeness of it, was the most eloquent thing she had ever heard from him. Spring came to the Double R and to Alma's parcel with the specific glory of Kansas Springs, the grassland going from brown to green almost overnight, the sky opening up in shades of blue that made the winter seem like a bad rumor. The winter wheat on her 40 acres had rooted beautifully, coming through the snow in tight dense rows that made her chest tight with satisfaction every morning when she walked the field. She had revised the irrigation channel plan over the winter, and Warren had helped her refine it using the natural grade of the land. And when the creek ran in the spring, the channel filled and the garden soil drank deeply. She moved officially to the Double R after the wedding, keeping her parcel as her own property, which had been very firmly established in the marriage agreement, she had insisted on writing up properly with the Wichita attorney Warren had engaged after Holloway's departure. The agreement made clear that her 40 acres were her separate property, managed by her, with her own income distinct from the ranch finances. Warren had signed it without argument, with the same directness he brought to things he understood were right. She still went to her parcel daily. She had kept the small shelter, which she had gradually improved through the winter into something more like a genuine farm office, with shelving for her records and a better stove. She managed the accounts of 3 businesses in Caldwell now, which she did partly from the farm office and partly from the mercantile, and her income from this work was enough to fund the farm's operational costs and begin building toward the larger structure she wanted to put up on the eastern side before the following winter. She also worked on the RR accounts, which had been in a state of functional but not optimal organization, and which she had, with Warren's slightly sheepish permission, quietly reorganized over the winter in ways that had identified 2 supply contracts that were overpriced and 1 pasture lease that could be renegotiated favorably. The savings were not trivial. Warren had looked at the revised accounts with the expression of a man who had been competently looked after without asking for it and was finding the experience slightly overwhelming. "You are," he had said, one evening in March, "the most efficient person I have ever met." "I have always had to be," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not criticizing. I am being grateful badly because I am not very good at it." She looked at him with the particular fond clarity she had developed for his ways. "You are getting better at it," she said. He laughed, which was something he did more readily now, and she thought, not for the first time, that the sound of it was one of the things she would want to remember if she was ever far from it. By May she knew she was pregnant. She told Warren on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table, directly and without preface, because there was no way to say this thing that was not simply saying it. She watched his face move through surprise, and then something large and vulnerable and entirely unguarded, and then he was across the kitchen and holding her with the careful intensity of a man who is trying to express something too big to say in words. "Are you all right?" he said against her hair. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have been reading everything available on the subject, and I am entirely healthy and I expect no complications." He laughed, and it was slightly shaky around the edges. "Of course you have been reading everything available, and I would like to keep working through the summer," she said. "The wheat harvest is in August and I intend to be there for it." "Of course you do," he said. He held her away from him slightly to look at her face. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, something very alive and present in them. "Alma, thank you. I think we both had a role in this," she said. "You know what I mean." She did know what he meant. He meant thank you for coming to this town. Thank you for not yielding. Thank you for sitting on that rise with me in August and trusting me with difficult truths. Thank you for the ring on your finger and the life you are building in this place that you made yours and therefore made mine better. She pressed her hand to his chest where his heart was and felt it beating, steady and real in hers. "You are welcome," she said. The summer of 1882 was the fullest and most honest season Alma Keene Reed had ever lived through. She harvested her wheat in August, 7 days before the baby was due, standing in the field with the crew Warren had arranged, with Rosa there because Rosa had refused to let her do this without her, watching the grain come in golden and abundant and better than even her best projection. Warren stood at the edge of the field in the morning light and watched her, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, pure and uncomplicated and lit from somewhere inside. They named their son Thomas, after her father, which had been Warren's suggestion, which had made her cry in a way she almost never cried, quietly and completely, in the privacy of the bedroom while he sat beside her, and did not try to stop it or fix it but just stayed, which was the thing she had needed. Thomas Gerald Reed was born on the 14th of August, 1882, in the bedroom of the RR Ranch house, with a doctor from Caldwell and Rosa present, and with Warren outside the bedroom door managing his composure with the same determined effort he brought to large and frightening things. When he came in and held his son for the first time, he stood by the window with the baby against his chest and looked out at the Kansas morning and did not speak for a long time. And when he finally turned to her, she saw on his face all the years that had been closed up in him opening at once, like a field at the end of a long winter. "He is perfect," Warren said. "He is," she agreed. "You are perfect," he said. "That is inaccurate," she said and smiled. He came and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and they looked at their son together in the morning light. And it was the simplest thing she had ever done, and the most complete, and she felt the deep settled rightness of it like the roots of winter wheat in good soil. Autumn brought the full accounting of what she had built. Her 40 acres had yielded a first wheat harvest that more than covered the year's operating costs and left a surplus to put back into the farm. She had begun plans for a permanent farmhouse on the eastern side of the parcel, a proper structure, 2 rooms with a loft, to serve eventually as a tenant farm if she chose to lease the farming operation and focus more on the account-keeping work, which had grown sufficiently that she was managing books for 6 businesses in Caldwell and 2 in the nearby town of Hunwell. Warren had expanded the Double R's water management across the rest of the ranch, using the principles they had worked out together on her parcel, and the result was a measurably better outcome in the dry months than in previous years. Bates had told her privately that in his 20 years with the ranch, he had not seen it run with this much foresight, which was the kind of compliment that she cherished, partly because it was genuine and partly because she suspected Bates did not give compliments carelessly. The Caldwell Land Registry had, at Judge Abernathy's recommendation during the spring session, engaged her to audit the county land filings for the Barrett-Hale aftermath, which was not a permanent position, but was a recognition of her expertise that felt meaningful in a way she was still getting used to. The acknowledgement of a woman's competence in this domain was not automatic in Caldwell, or anywhere, in 1882. She did not perform gratitude for it because she did not think it was a favor, but she noted it, and she used it, and she intended to continue using it. Clara came from Abilene in October with her husband James and their 2 children, a boy named Robert who was 4 and a girl named Lily who was 2, and the Double R was loud and full in a way that made it clear it had been waiting for this. Warren with his nephew and niece was a revelation. Patient and warm and willing to be entirely undignified in the service of making a 4-year-old laugh, which she stored away in her heart with the same care she gave to everything important. Clara was a bright and direct woman who reminded Alma of the better qualities of her brother, organized into a different shape by a different life. They liked each other immediately, with the particular recognition of 2 capable women who have not had enough of that kind of company. Clara held Thomas with an ease that came from 2 children of her own, and looked at him, and then at her brother, and then at Alma with the expression of someone whose long-standing prayer has been answered. "He looks like your mother," Clara told Warren, touching the baby's cheek. "Does he?" Warren said, with a quality in his voice that was quiet and layered and entirely real. "He has her eyes," Clara said. "The color exactly." Warren looked at his son for a long time after that, and Alma watched him and felt the full texture of what it was to be the woman beside him in this moment, carrying the weight of his history alongside her own, and finding that the combined weight was not heavier but lighter, the way 2 people carrying a load together find the geometry of it easier than either could manage alone. December brought snow, which turned the Double R and Alma's 40 acres into a landscape of clean white silence that she found beautiful in a way she had not expected. She stood on the porch of the ranch house on a morning a week before Christmas and looked out at the snow-covered fields, at the fence line of her parcel just visible to the west, at the white-capped roof of the farm office she had built, and felt the full accumulated weight of what the year had been. She had come to this town in June of 1881 with $40 and a deed, and a name she was not sure meant anything anymore, and the town had owed her nothing, which was entirely true and entirely fine because she had not come here to be owed anything by a town. She had come here to build something, which she had done. She had come here to establish a footing, which she had done. She had not come here to fall in love with a rancher who had first looked at her like an inconvenient legal problem, and had become, with the kind of slow and genuine inevitability that the best things arrive with, the person she trusted most in the world. But that was what had happened, and she was not, this December morning, standing on her porch in the snow and questioning it. She was simply in it, in the full warm certainty of it, which was a thing she had not known she was building toward when she argued across a registry desk in the July heat. Warren came up behind her with a coat she had not brought with her and put it over her shoulders, and she turned and looked at him, this man in his flannel shirt and his work boots, with the lines of his face in the winter light and the amber of his eyes and the particular way he looked at her that she now understood was one of the most precious things she had ever been given. He put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch together looking out at the snow. "Clara wants us in Abilene for Christmas," she said. "I know," he said. "Thomas will see his first Christmas in a house full of people." "He will not know it," she said. "No," he said, "but we will." She leaned into him slightly and felt his arm tighten around her and thought about her mother in the tin photograph, the face she could not quite remember clearly, and thought about what she might say if she could see this porch and this morning and this man and this life. She thought her mother would recognize it. The built thing, the genuine thing, the thing made from work and honesty and the specific bravery of a woman who had learned early that if you want something solid to stand on, you have to make it yourself. And then she thought that she had not made this alone entirely, and that was the part that still surprised her in the best way. The discovery that accepting help from the right person, trusting the right person, was not a diminishment of the thing you had built but an enlargement of it. "Warren," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want more children," she said. "Two at least. I want a full house." She felt his laugh before she heard it, the rumble of it in his chest against her shoulder. "Two at least," he said. "I can work with that. And I want to keep my parcel," she said. "Even when the farm is leased, it is mine." "It is absolutely yours," he said. "I would not dream of suggesting otherwise. And I want to continue the accounting work." "Alma," he said, with the warm exasperation of a man who has had several versions of this conversation, "I have never once suggested you should stop the accounting work." "I know," she said. "I am telling you, not asking you." "I know the difference," he said. "It is one of the things I love about you." She turned to look at him, and he looked back at her in the clear December light, and she thought that this was what a good thing looked like. Not the absence of difficulty or complexity or the weight of history, but two people who had looked at each other's whole reality, the complicated and the difficult and the beautiful and the specific, and had said yes to all of it. She had arrived in a town that owed her nothing. The deed in her father's strongbox had given her a reason to come, but it had not given her any of what she had found here. The life she had built on those 40 acres and in this house and with this man and with this child who slept inside in his cradle, that had been built from the things she brought with her, and the choices she made once she arrived, and the willingness to trust something worth trusting. And Warren Reed had made sure, not by any single grand gesture but by the accumulated honesty of 100 ordinary ones, that she left nothing owed at all, that she left nothing of herself behind, that she carried the full sum of herself into a life that was big enough to hold it. In the spring of 1884, she planted her third field of winter wheat, which by now had become one of the highest-yielding small wheat operations in that part of Kansas. She did this with their second son, James Thomas Reed, strapped against her back in the way that working women on the frontier had always carried their children, practical and close and warm. Warren was in the south pasture with Bates and the spring herd, and Rosa was coming for supper that evening, and Thomas at 20 months was sitting at the edge of the field with remarkable gravity, and a stick he was applying to the turned soil with the seriousness of a very small person who has observed serious people working and is doing his best. She paused in the field and looked at her sons, and at the parcel around her, the fence line she had built, and the creek she could hear from the east, and the farm office that was solid and well built in hers, and beyond it the double R on its rise, the smoke from the kitchen chimney visible in the clear spring air. She felt the fullness of it without trying to measure it, the way you feel a good deep breath. She had a letter in her pocket from Judge Abernathy's office asking if she would be willing to serve as a formal county auditor for the land registry on a permanent part-time basis, which she intended to accept. She had a wheat harvest coming in August that was projected to be her best yet. She had 2 sons and a husband and a parcel of 40 acres that she had argued for across a registry desk in July of 1881. And she had a town that had given her nothing when she arrived, and which she had given something back to anyway, because that was who she was, because that was what you did when you built a life somewhere. Thomas looked up from his serious work with the stick and found her watching him and smiled, wide and uncomplicated, with Warren's eyes and her father's direct gaze. And she smiled back and felt something move through her that was simple and enormous and free of any shadow at all. The Kansas sky above was the full blue of a spring morning, enormous and clear from one edge of the world to the other, and the wheat was coming in green in the rows below her, and the creek ran at the eastern edge of the parcel with the sound of something alive, and Alma Keene Reed stood in the middle of it all and felt, entirely and without qualification, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.